Hello, everyone. Now, in the closing pages of the New Testament, we encounter a group of writings traditionally associated with one name, and that is John. However, when we look more closely, the picture, well, it becomes far more intriguing. See, we find three short letters that offer a glimpse into the everyday life of early Christian communities. But before we move, into that scriptural meat, if you like, of this new series, Series 8, what will help us greatly is to have really an understanding of the historical backdrop to all these letters and events. You see, where one event dominates, well, the entire period. And of course, that was the siege of Jerusalem and its destruction during the First Jewish-Roman War, AD 66 to 73. When the Romans destroyed the city and the temple in AD 70. Now, this changed the Jewish and early Christian world dramatically. See, for Jewish believers in Jesus, it created a huge question. If the temple is gone, what now? Where does the center of faith move? See, after AD 70, many Jesus communities they were no longer centered in Jerusalem for obvious reasons. Leadership that had been associated with figures like James the Just, they were no longer geographically central. The movement began spreading across the Eastern European Roman world. See, after the war, many communities were located in cities such as Antioch in Syria, Ephesus, Asia Minor, Alexandria, Egypt. See, those cities were not primarily Jewish environments. No, they were deeply Greek speaking and philosophically influenced by that culture. So this meant that the message about Jesus was now being discussed in a different intellectual world. See, ideas from Greek philosophy, they were everywhere. Terms like logos, light and darkness, truth and knowledge. They were already part of the existing sort of philosophical discussions that were taking place. Now, this helps explain why the later Gospel of John sounds so different from the earlier kingdom language found in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Internal disagreements were already emerging, and this surfaces in the three letters attributed to John, demonstrating, of course, that the early Jesus movement was not a single uniform system. Different communities emphasized different things. Some emphasized ethical obedience, love, discipleship. Others, well, they began exploring the nature of Christ himself. And of course, this tension appears clearly in these letters that we attribute to John. See, the writer warns about teachers who had left the community. See, in the first letter of John, he writes, 1 John 2 and verse 19, they went out from us, but they did not belong to us. Now, that sentence tells us something really important. See, the debate was inside the movement itself. So these early Christian communities were still very small. It's easy for us modern readers, if you like, to imagine a large organized church. But in the late first century, communities were usually small house gatherings, perhaps 20, maybe as many as 40 people meeting in homes. Leaders were often traveling teachers or elders. Some with their own ideas even. See, the author of 2nd and 3rd John simply calls himself the elder. Now, this suggests authority was based on personal reputation and teaching, not on some institutional office. However, why do these letters sound so pastoral? See, if you read the 3 letters carefully, the tone becomes clearer considering this historical backdrop setting, that we've just recounted. The writer is trying to hold together, a fragile community that is facing theological disagreements, traveling teachers with their own ideas, internal divisions. But of course, his strategy, the elder, he doesn't come up with complex theology. No, instead, he emphasizes 3 things repeatedly. Remain in the teaching from the beginning. Love one another. Walk in the light. In other words, he is trying to stabilize the community around the ethical teachings of Jesus. Very simple, isn't it? See, this historical background leads naturally to the central question we will be asking in this series 8. See, as the message of Jesus moved into the Greek-speaking world, did something begin to happen? See, the language used to describe Jesus, it started to expand. Some communities focused on discipleship and ethical living. Others began expressing faith in the more philosophical terms, if you like. And these writings, attributed to John the Apostle, they sit right in the middle of that transition period. See, the letters, they sound very practical and pastoral. However, the gospel, which came later, introduces the famous language of the Logos. And the book of Revelation reflects yet another style entirely. See, so understanding that historical moment will help guide us through this development carefully. Now, when people think about the writings of John, they usually think of the famous opening of his gospel. Okay? In the beginning was the Word. But before we read that remarkable passage, there are 3 small writings preserved in the New Testament and that are often overlooked by us. You see, the 3 short letters, 1st John, 2nd John, 3rd John. Letters that do not speak like philosophy. Letters that speak like, a pastor caring for his community. And the writer, those letters, he introduces himself not as an apostle. No. He calls himself the elder. And in this new series, we're going to examine writings, that are traditionally attributed to John the Apostle. Those 3 letters, the Gospel, and of course the Apocalypse. And we will ask, really the same question we have asked throughout this journey. What are those? Do these writings reflect the mind of Jesus Christ? Or do they show signs of some sort of theological development? So before exploring the gospel, it may be helpful to begin with these three letters, that are preserved near the end of the New Testament. And of course, they're simply known as 1st John, 2nd John, and 3rd John. Now, the first of these is really quite different from most New Testament letters. Why? Well, it has no opening greeting. No author is named. No specific audience is even addressed. Instead, it reads almost like a pastoral sermon written to encourage believers to remain faithful. The other two letters, well, are much shorter. And in those letters, well, the author identifies himself only as the elder. This raises really an interesting historical question. See, was the author actually John the Apostle? Or are we sort of hearing the voice of a later leader, within the same Johannine community? Well, the letters themselves do not answer that question directly, but what they do reveal very clearly is the concern of the writer, this elder. Because his focus is not on speculation, it's not on philosophy. His focus is on how believers live their lives. See, very early in the first letter, we read these words, 1 John 3 and verse 11. This is the message you have heard from the beginning. We should love one another. Now, that statement should sound very familiar because it echoes the central command given by Jesus Christ himself. John chapter 13 and verse 34. How familiar are we with this verse? A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you also must love one another. And the author of the letter repeatedly returns to this theme. See, love is not presented as a sort of a feeling or an emotion. No, it's presented as the defining mark of authentic faith. And the letter even goes so far as to say, 1 John 2 and verse 6, whoever claims to abide in him must walk as Jesus walked. Now, this really is an extraordinary statement when we think about it. See, the true test of faith is not simply belief. The test is imitation, walking as Jesus walked. So, throughout the letter, this elder stresses something really very practical. Faith must be visible in conduct. For example, we read 1 John 2 and verse 4. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar. Well, those are very strong words, aren't they? But they echo something very similar taught by James the Just, the brother of Jesus. You'll recall James chapter 2 and verse 17. Faith by itself, if it does not result in action, well, it's dead. See, in both cases, the emphasis is the same. Faith must be expressed through obedience and love. This emphasis, it brings us very close again to the teachings of Jesus. For he said at Matthew 7 and verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father. So, there in these three letters, we find something striking. The focus is not on some sort of complex theology, No, the focus is on faithfulness in daily life. But the letters were clearly written during a time of division. This whole backdrop that we've pointed out. At one time, the author writes at 1 John 2 and verse 19, they went out from us, but they did not belong to us. See, this really suggests a split within the community. Some teachers had left and were now spreading ideas that this elder, believed were dangerous. Now, one issue appears to involve who Jesus truly was. We read at 1 John 4 and verse 2. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. This suggests that some were denying the full humanity of Jesus. So already we begin to see how theological debates were emerging in the early movement. And the elder's response, well, it's not some philosophical argument against that. No, his response is to return again to the teachings of Jesus, which are love, obedience, truth. And there is something else which is really worth noting. It is what the letters do not emphasize. See, these letters say very little about subjects that later became central in Christian theology. For example, we do not find any developed theory of the atonement sacrifice. We do not find philosophical discussions about divine nature. We do not find the famous logos language that appears in the opening of the Gospel of John. No. Instead, what do we find? We find repeated appeals to something much, much simpler. Walk in the light. Love one another. Keep the commandments. Remain faithful. The truth is simple, in other words. See, these small letters may not be dramatic, but they give us a glimpse, really, into the life of the early community, which was struggling, really, to remain faithful. And the voice guiding them speaks like a pastor more than a philosopher. Again and again, he returns the same simple message. Love one another. Walk as Jesus walked. See, if these letters truly preserve the voice of this community tradition, then their focus really is unmistakable. It is not speculation, it is not ideology, but faithful living. And if we truly are seeking to understand the teachings of Jesus Christ, then perhaps this is where we must always return to walk as he walked. Because ultimately, that is the mind of Jesus. Now, in the next second and third letter, well, what we begin to see is a community really in a bit of a crisis and how that is to be combated. See, in the second letter, this elder presents a sort of a cautionary note of a problem that the congregation needs to be aware of. 2 John 7 through to 11. I'm going to read all those verses. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, refusing to confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Any such person is the deceiver and the antichrist. Watch yourselves so that you do not lose what we have worked for, but that you may be fully rewarded. See, anyone who runs ahead without remaining in the teachings of Christ does not have God. Whoever remains in his teaching has both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you but does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your home or even greet him. Whoever greets such a person shares in his evil deeds. Please note, verse 7 simply defines Antichrist as someone who denies the fundamental humanity of Jesus. He was a human being. Now, this raises a more detailed subject, which we will address in an episode very shortly. What I'm going to try and do is have it covered before the gospel episode, which of course comes next, as that will impact on our understanding of the gospel as we read through it. So, for the moment, we will leave the subject of the Antichrist and move on to the third letter. One of the most interesting features of the third letter is that it introduces to us individuals within one of those early communities. The letter is addressed to a believer named Gaius. 3 John chapter 1 and verse 5. Beloved, you are faithful in what you are doing for the brothers, and especially since they are strangers to you. See, Gaius he's praised for his faithfulness. He has welcomed traveling teachers and supported their work. How? Well, by offering hospitality. See, he's helping to strengthen the wider network of the early Christian communities. And the letter, well, it also introduces another figure. It commends another believer, a man named Demetrius. 3 John 1 verse 12. Demetrius has received a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. We also testify for him, and you know that our testimony is true. See, he is described as someone who has a good reputation among the believers, someone whose life reflects the truth of the message they follow. Then, finally, a man named Diotrephes, 3 John 1 and verses 9 and 10. I have written to the church about this, but Diotrephes, who loves to be first, will not receive our instruction. So if I come, I will call attention to his malicious slander against us. And unsatisfied with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and forbids those who want to do so, even putting them out of the church. See, the writer is here describes him as someone who loves to be first. According to the letter, Diotrephes refuses to welcome visiting teachers. More than that, he prevents others from offering them hospitality, from them offering the teachers hospitality. Those who disagree with him are even expelled from the community. So, in just a few lines, we get a glimpse of something which is really very human, isn't it? You see, even in these early decades, the Christian movement was not without tension. Questions of leadership and authority were already beginning to appear. Right. Through these three individuals, we catch a sort of a rare glimpse of everyday life in the earliest churches. Real people, real communities, and the real challenge of trying to live faithfully together. Now, one detail about these letters has fascinated readers for centuries. The author never actually names himself. Instead, he introduces himself with a simple title, The Elder. Now, traditionally, these writings have been connected with John the Apostle. However, some early Christian writers mention another figure known as John the Elder. Now, if that tradition is correct, then more than one leader named John may have been associated with these communities. So this raises really an intriguing question, doesn't it? See, were all of the Johannine writings produced by the same person? Or do they reflect the voice of a wider community shaped by the teachings associated with John? See, many historians, for them, the most important insight is not simply identifying the author. No, it is understanding, well, the community behind these writings. Now, we will leave it there as there's plenty more to come. So, once again, thank you. Thank you very much, and see you next time.